Welcome to the course Disability Studies in India, Historical, Social and Cultural Perspective. In this module, we are talking about theories and models of disabilities. I deliberately covered model of disability in my previous lecture for the very reason that we are going to talk theories afterwards. Now, in lecture number 2, 3, 4, 5, they all are touching certain theoretical understanding of disabilities, and without this model it would have been difficult for us to talk about theories of disability. So, before I move ahead, there is a book by Tobin Siebers, Disability Theory, which is extremely significant and helpful. So, this lecture which I have prepared is mainly influenced what Tobin Siebers is talking about in that book. Obviously, it's not the same, but there is a theory given by Simi Linton, Davis. So, these three people we have read. So, I would also suggest you people to read these books, let's say Enforcing Normalcy by Leonard J. Davis and Extraordinary Bodies by Rosemary Gall and Thompson, and then we have Tobin Siebers' very famous book called Disability Theory. So, in this lecture number 2 of this module, I am going to talk about disability identity. So, I have already given you a slight understanding of that how affirmative model and minority model talks about that disability can be looked at as a minority identity. It can be looked at as a form of identity, right. So, in this lecture, what I am going to talk about that how we can look at disability as an identity and what are the problems in looking at disability as an identity. All right. So, for much of human history, disability has been looked as through the medical lens, right. It has been seen as that individual, there is a problem rooted in the body. So, there is something to be cured, something to be corrected to allow a person to achieve full human potential, right. So, as the medical model which we discussed in the previous lecture, it defines it as a personal defect that must be remedied in order for an individual to function fully in societies. And then in contrast, the more recent field of disability studies shift the focus from the individual to society. So, it tries to understand disability not as an inherent flaw, but it looks at it as a result of social injustice. So, this perspective emphasizes that disability does not require the cure or elimination of the person. It looks at that it demands at the change in social and physical environments that create barriers. So, disability studies is moving away from treating or curing disability and instead analyzes the social meaning, symbols, stigma attached to disability. So, what disability studies, as I have already discussed in the previous lecture, so I am not going to talk more on it, but what it does not only talk about how medical model has looked at disability, but it moved beyond to see the metaphors. It looks at the metaphor, how certain metaphors are associated with people with disability, what are the genesis of those metaphors, how those metaphors evolved, how those metaphors were appropriated, what are the images circulated to stigmatize people with disability, what is the relation of people with disability with those images. So, here you see that it is not only limiting to what medical institution has to say about disability, but rather the social meaning generated on the basis of disability. So, it interrogates how these factors contribute to system of exclusion and oppression, how it challenges the pervasive idea that an able body and mind are prerequisite for being a valuable human being. So, disability does not only talks about certain barriers, it goes beyond and talks about that how society is founded upon certain presuppositions that a very good defined society is where able body and able mind resides. So, two criteria. One, it's not only sound mind as well as sound body is a prerequisite to be called human, to live in a society. This notion was challenged by disability studies. So, disability studies highlights the unique forms of social oppression faced by disabled people, while also affirming the positive contribution they bring to society. So, the core tenet of the field is that the presence of disabled people in any discussion fundamentally alters not only the culture of the conversation, but also the nature of the argument presented. For instance, disability studies reframes some of today's most debated issues. Let's say, for example, abortion, assisted suicide and genetic research, which I will be talking further in detail, how they can be looked at from the new perspectives, how they challenge, how disability studies challenges conventional thinking associated with associated with abortion. How do you look at assisted suicide? Why there is a need for assisted suicide? What kind of a body is asking for assisted suicide? And what is all genetic research is about? Right? Why do you want to improve your genes? Why do you want to alter your genes? Why there is a lady who goes for abortion? Obviously, there are multiple reasons, but disability studies intervene there as well to understand that is it unwanted child because it's a disabled child? So, the point what I am making is that disability studies does not only reduce itself to look at the societal barriers, but it provides very fresh perspectives to look at these important concepts of the society, of the academia, where they deal in everyday lives. Moving ahead, so disability is not merely a physical or mental defect, it's a cultural and minority identity. So, to frame disability as an identity is to acknowledge that it's not an inherent biological or natural trait, but rather flexible social category. What I mean by flexible social category, for example, that a body is considered to be a disabled in one particular setup, but may not be considered in another particular setup, right? So, it's basically a marker of social identity. It can function in contradictory ways. It is important to recognize these contradictions as they frequently arise in discussion within the field of disability studies, right? So, these are the way through which the idea of identity emerges, right? So, when considered as a condition of bodies and minds, disability can have both positive and negative implications. For example, many disabled people do not see their disability as a flaw or personal failing, and for good reason, right? They are comfortable with the kind of body they have, they are very much okay in accessing everything, they are fine with it, they look at disability not with any negative meanings, but with very positive implications. And they do not even want their body to be fixed or cured. But there are also people, they may be ambivalent about acquiring new or additional disability. So, there is a woman who embraces her deafness, may not welcome the idea of developing cancer, and a man with post-polio syndrome may not necessarily look forward transitioning from crutches to a power chair, though he might, because disability is very fluid, which I will be talking about as my lecture proceeds. But for now, what I am going to talk about, what I am talking, that how these two way to look at disability identity, right? How a person may look at their body itself. So, there is a mixed feeling which does not result from preference for able-bodiedness. It's not like they want to have able body, but it's a concept that can seem difficult to escape. So, there is a deep personal connection between human identity and physical embodiment, right? So there is a personal connection between these two. It is natural to feel comfortable in one's own body. It is also that someone achieves that comfort. Imagining oneself as a different is not easy. So for better or worse, disability often symbolizes the vulnerability of the human condition, reminding us that people are subject to change, deterioration, and eventually death. So disability is a very powerful, it provides a very powerful discourse to look at everything. What you are today may not be tomorrow. You may be disabled, or you may be looks from different ideas, different perspectives. And then we have Susan Wendell. She highlights that there is a change in the built environment can improve accessibility for many. However, may not always benefit people with painful or chronic disabilities, right? So change in the environment may help in accessing the society. But what about the pain that one always goes through? So Susan Wendell underscores the fact that the reality of certain bodies, including their pain and limitation, is a very harsh truth. It must be acknowledged. So this recognition it complicates the idea of disability as wholly positive. So here you see that there are many ways to look at disability. That's the point of what I'm making. It's not all positive. It's also something complicates to, I won't say negative, but I would say that the way one looks at disability as a positive identity can be challenged. So the presence of disability challenges traditional notion of identity. It offers a very perspective that is inherently more fluid than those associated with gender, race, sexuality, nation, or class. For example, you tend to be stable throughout life, but disability underscores the impermanence of able-bodiedness. So for example, I have talked about it. Let's say, for example, I'm a Indian, right? I'm a British man. That's how I look at myself. I'm sure that I will not wake up tomorrow until miracle or something very tragic or something very different or very, something miracle happens. I will not wake up as a, let's say, white person, right? Or white woman, or white man. Or I will not wake up as a 10 feet tall. If I am 5'10", if that is my height, I am sure that in the next morning I will not wake up as a person who has the height of 5 and 10 inch. But I could become a quadriplegic. There's a possibility. And this idea highlights a very fundamental truth. And the truth is, there is nobody which can claim that it will remain so-called able. However, able is a very ideal state. I'll talk this in the later lectures. But here what my point is that all other identities will inevitably intersect with some of disability over time. One may become old, right? So disability is going to come, is going to approach you either today or tomorrow. You cannot escape it. You can escape from having a height of 5 and 10 if you are 3 and 4 feet, right? But saying so, it's really difficult. It's not possible. So look at that, how everyone is going to carry disability identity. That's the point I'm making. So disability theorists have noted that disability often serves as a foundation for the marginalization of other identities, particular minority identities. So there is a person called Michelle and Snyder, narrative prosthesis they have written beautiful book and talk about the social position is stigmatized by factors such as gender, class, nationality and race frequently rely on disability to visually reinforce the de-evaluation of marginalized communities. Douglas Benton similarly reveals that in US history, discrimination against people of color, women and immigrants was often justified by framing these groups as disabled or inherently inferior. Right. So, talking about that, how there are also other identities are criticized, discriminated by devaluing those bodies and aligning those bodies as disabled bodies with the disabled bodies. So, while progress has been made in combating prejudices against this historically oppressed group, the association of their identities with disability has enabled new forms of discrimination. Disability remains the last frontier of unquestioned inferiority because society's overwhelming preference for able-bodiedness makes it difficult to fully embrace disabled people and to acknowledge the unnecessarily and often violent exclusion they face. So, these intersection of disability with other identities, it forces us to reconsider the foundation of human identity and how it functions in a society that still largely devalues disabled lives. All right. So, disability operates in a symbolic realm distinct from other forms of minority difference. Disability functions as what can be termed an othering other, a diacritical marker that reinforces inferior or marginal status without being explicitly acknowledged in the process. Instead, minority identities such as those defined by race, gender, class or nationalities that intersect with disability are often viewed as inherently pathological. In other words, the symbolic link with disability disables these identity, further solidifying their negative inferior status in the social hierarchies. So, the key question then becomes, what roles does disability play in shaping discrimination against minority identities? Look at the question I have framed so that we can think on these questions. What role does disability play in shaping discrimination against minority identities without being overtly recognized as such? How does its presence make it easier to marginalize and oppress other minority groups? Moreover, how does disability influence and intersect with these identities and vice versa? So, if disability is often viewed as abstract symbol of otherness rather than as a lived experience, how might deliberate insistence on its reality reshape our theories? So, disability, what does disability studies is now here, right? It seeks to reverse this dynamic by deliberately interpreting disability on its own terms while recognizing its impact on intersecting identities. So, here when I was talking about disability identities, I am sure that you must have understood so far that it's not the disability identities about so far the kind of bodies you were looking at, but you could see how these identities intersect with other identities as well. So, when minority identities are pathologized through their association with disability, this process is not merely metaphorical or symbolic. It's also referential, drawing on historical and representational structure in which disability, illness and injury have long been used to signify human inferiority. So, the pathologization of this identity calls for a rigorous examination not only of the symbolic association with disability, but also of a disability as a concrete reality that is part of the human condition. So, by acknowledging disability in this way, we can challenge the ingrained systems of oppression that use disability as a tool to devalue other minority identities. So here what disabilities is trying to do, it is trying to turn the table upside down. So far what used to happen, that other identities were marginalized by tagging them as a disabled identity, right? So let's say, for example, the racial people were considered as a, so I mean, see why I am coming back to the key question, because this question needs a reflection. They are very important. For example, when we are looking at the role disability play in shaping discrimination against minority identities without being overtly recognized as such. So what this question is asking for? This question is asking you to think upon that how a pregnant woman can be considered as a disabled. It question is asking for to look at that how old man is also looked at as a disabled. This question is also asking you to look at that how black people were considered as inferior people because they are not white. So black was looked at in relation to the white. So here the point what I am talking about, that how certain these identities were discriminated by indirectly tagging disability identity along with them. So there is a black identity, but there is also identity of being disabled. There is a pregnant woman's identity, but there is also identity that she is a disabled. There is an identity that is an old woman, but old woman identity also aligns with disabled, right? So this is a one question that is extremely significant to think about how other identities intersect with this. The second question that I propose, how does its presence make it easier to marginalize and oppress other minority groups, right? How does its presence make it easier to marginalize and oppress other minority groups, right? How people want to distance itself with these identities. Like there are identities, like for example, if I have to talk about it, there is an article by Anita Ghai, An Excluded Agenda of Feminism, where she is talking about that how feminism, when it's fighting for rights and equality, so on and so forth, it did not take disabled women into the account. It did not talk for disabled women as well. So the one fear it had, maybe, which talks about that the stance of feminism will not be as strong as it is without taking disabled women into the consideration. So, or possibly they thought that first let's fight for the women, then later on we can talk about women with disabilities, right? So this is the second question which asks us to look at. And third, which I am arguing, is that how does disability influence and intersect with this identity, and vice versa, that how they both are aligned with each other. So if disability is often viewed, it's viewed as an abstract symbol of otherness than as a lived experience, then the question comes, how might a deliberate insistence on its reality reshape our theory of identity? So these questions I am raising over here, which I would be explaining as I proceed into the next lectures, right? That how, this idea of otherness associated with disability asks us to look at the deliberate insistence on its reality that reshapes our theories of identity, right? So which is why you see that disability studies is trying to interpret disability from a different perspectives, by intersecting identities and also by dissecting identities, that how there is another identity implicitly attached, where how a body or identity is pathologized by associating with disability, and that is why it looks at, it examines that the association with disability of the minority identity has potential to pathologize or makes it more strong claim, right? A more strong claim in the sense that everyone can be disabled. No one on the earth can claim that they cannot be disabled. So there is an identity called disability identity which can be attached with every other forms of identity. Right? So, therefore, in the end of this lecture, what I am asking you to look at, what I am asking you to examine, that how the pathologization of these identities is inviting us for a rigorous examination, not only looking at the symbolic association with disability, but also of a disability as a concrete reality, not simply looking at it as an association, but that's a part of the human conditions, right? Disability, not looking at disability as obviously as an identity, but not as just a metaphor, negative projection, or pathologized representation, but also to look at as a human condition, right? It's like having it's like getting a human condition of a disability. So, therefore, by acknowledging disability in this way, we can challenge the ingrained system of oppression that use disability as a tool to devalue other minorities' identities. So, I am asking you to look at that, what is identity is all about, like how one identifies, with what one identifies, why someone not identifies with something else, what is the process involved through which a person identify himself or herself, right? What happens if other identities are also he accommodates in itself? Let's say, for example, what about a person who is a black as well as disabled, or let's say a woman, disabled and black. So, there are three identities intersected: gender identity, racial identity, and also disability identity. So, how we are going to talk about this kind of, that kind of formations, that kind of form of looking at those kind of bodies, All right. So, with this, I would like to end my lecture. Thank you so much. See you next time, and where we are going to talk further about how the ideology of ability is talking about identities, and how identities unfold itself. All right. So, in the next coming lectures, we will be talking about that. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye bye.